Hi guys, the night air over the Nile River was still warm, even long after sunset. A soft wind moved slowly across the dark water. Reeds near the riverbank bent gently, brushing together with a dry whispering sound. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and then fell quiet again. The stars above ancient Egypt looked endless. Clear and silent. Bright enough to reflect in the slow-moving river below. Most homes had already gone dark. Inside small mud-brick houses, families rested close together on woven mats stuffed with reeds and straw. Sandals sat near doorways coated in dust from the day's labor. Clay jars stood against walls cooling slowly in the night air. The smell of baked bread still lingered softly inside many homes, mixed with smoke from cooking fires that had only recently faded. The people of Egypt were tired. Farmers had spent the day beneath the heavy sun. Builders had carried stone along crowded roads. Fishermen had stood knee-deep in river water for hours, pulling rough nets through the current. Scribes had bent over wooden tables in quiet rooms, their backs aching from long work with reed pens and black ink. Now the land rested. And for a very long time, it rested like this almost every night. Year after year. Century after century. Ancient Egypt remained stable longer than almost any civilization in human history. Kingdoms rose and disappeared around it. Cities elsewhere burned, collapsed, or scattered into silence. But Egypt endured. Quietly. Patiently. Like the steady river itself. Its people woke each morning expecting the world to remain familiar. The Nile would rise again. Bread would bake again. Children would run through dusty streets again. Boats would drift across the water again. The same routines continued through generations so distant from one another that grandparents and grandchildren sometimes lived beneath entirely different dynasties while still walking the same roads and farming the same dark soil beside the river. This deep stability did not happen because life was easy. For ordinary people, life in ancient Egypt was often exhausting. The heat alone could wear down the body slowly over time. During summer months, the sun arrived early and pressed heavily onto fields, workshops, and crowded streets. Workers wrapped linen around their heads to keep sweat from falling into their eyes. Dust clung to skin. Sand gathered inside sandals. Even breathing could feel thick during the hottest afternoons. Still, people continued their routines. In the pale light before sunrise, farmers woke first. The villages along the Nile slowly stirred awake in darkness. Roosters called softly from fenced yards. Goats shifted and stamped near sleeping homes. Inside narrow rooms, mothers quietly prepared coarse bread from grain that had been ground the day before using heavy stone tools worn smooth by years of labor. The grinding itself was tiring work. Women often knelt for long periods beside low grinding stones, pushing grain back and forth until their shoulders and wrists became sore. Fine dust from the flour coated their hands and arms. By middle age, many workers carried permanent pain in their backs and knees from these repeated daily tasks. But the work continued because the river continued. The Nile shaped nearly everything in Egyptian life. Without it, the land beyond the riverbanks became dry desert very quickly. The green world of Egypt was narrow. A ribbon of life surrounded by endless heat and stone. From above, the fertile land beside the river looked almost fragile, like a dark line painted through the desert. Yet this narrow strip supported millions of lives across centuries. Every year, floodwaters arrived from far to the south. The river slowly expanded beyond its banks, covering fields in dark water rich with black soil. Farmers watched these floods carefully because their entire survival depended on them. If the flooding was too weak, crops suffered. If the flooding became too strong, homes and storage buildings could be damaged. Most years, though, the Nile behaved with remarkable consistency. This mattered deeply. People could plan their lives around predictability. Seeds could be stored calmly. Work schedules remained familiar. Taxes could be collected regularly. Temples received offerings. Granaries filled slowly but steadily. The entire rhythm of Egyptian civilization moved together with the river's dependable cycle. And ordinary people understood this rhythm from childhood. A young boy waking beside the Nile might spend the early morning carrying baskets of grain while cool air still lingered over the fields. By noon, the same boy could be helping guide cattle through wet soil beneath blazing sunlight. Years later, he might watch his own children perform the same work almost exactly as he once had. This repetition created something powerful. People trusted tomorrow. Not perfectly. Not completely. Illness still came. Floods sometimes failed. Accidents happened constantly. But compared to many ancient societies, Egypt offered long stretches of continuity that allowed daily life to feel grounded and familiar. Even the homes reflected the sense of routine. Most ordinary houses were simple structures made from mud bricks dried beneath the sun. Builders mixed mud with straw and shaped it by hand before leaving the bricks to harden in the heat. These homes were practical rather than beautiful. Thick walls helped block daytime heat. Small windows limited sunlight and dust. Roofs were flat and often used for sleeping during especially warm nights. Inside, furniture remained minimal. A low stool. A woven sleeping mat. Clay storage jars. Simple wooden chests. Life centered more around work, food, family, and survival than around possessions. Children slept beside parents. Older relatives sometimes shared the same crowded rooms. During summer nights, many families climbed onto rooftops where cooler air drifted slowly through the darkness. Above them, the stars remained steady. This mattered more than we sometimes realize. Stable civilizations are often built not only through armies or rulers, but through ordinary expectations. People need to believe the world around them will continue functioning tomorrow in roughly the same way it functioned yesterday. Ancient Egypt gave many people this feeling. Even religion reinforced calm continuity. The gods of Egypt were connected closely to natural cycles. Sunrise. Flooding rivers. Growing crops. Death and rebirth. Order and balance. The Egyptians believed deeply in maintaining harmony within the world. Chaos was feared because chaos threatened survival itself. This idea touched almost every part of life. Farmers prayed for balance in the flooding seasons. Scribes recorded grain supplies carefully to maintain order. Workers followed routines that had existed for generations. Priests performed ceremonies daily with slow precision inside cool temple halls lit by oil lamps and drifting incense smoke. The temples themselves rarely slept. Long before sunrise, priests quietly entered sacred rooms carrying water and linen cloth. Stone floors beneath their sandals remained cool even during the hottest months. In silence, they washed statues of the gods, changed ceremonial clothing, and prepared offerings of bread, beer, fruit, and flowers. Outside, the first light slowly touched the horizon. Birds began calling near the riverbanks. Boats loosened from wooden docks drifted gently against ropes. The city slowly awakened. In larger towns, narrow streets filled quickly with movement. Bakers prepared ovens before dawn because midday heat became too intense later. Potters shaped wet clay beside spinning wheels. Fishermen returned carrying catches wrapped in damp nets that smelled strongly of river water and reeds. The smell of Egypt itself must have been unforgettable. Warm mud after flooding. Smoke from cooking fires. Sweat beneath linen clothing. Fish drying in sunlight. Fresh bread. Animal dung. Wet reeds. Dust carried constantly through hot air. Life was physical and immediate. Workers felt the weight of every task inside their muscles. Builders hauling stone blocks for temples or tombs worked in organized crews. Contrary to many old stories, large numbers of these workers were not slaves in chains but laborers supporting massive state projects through seasonal work systems tied closely to agricultural cycles. When floodwaters covered farmland, many farmers temporarily became construction workers. This arrangement helped Egypt remain stable too. The government could direct large labor forces during certain seasons without permanently removing farmers from food production. Workers received food, clothing, shelter, and sometimes beer as payment. Conditions were still difficult. Bodies became worn down from hauling stone beneath brutal heat. Feet blistered against rough ground. Hands cracked and bled from rope and tools. At night, exhausted workers rested in crowded sleeping areas near construction sites. Some rubbed oil into aching shoulders. Others sat quietly sharing bread while darkness slowly cooled the desert air. Nearby, scribes recorded supplies carefully. Scribes held an unusual position in Egyptian society. Many people could not read or write, but scribes spent years learning symbols, calculations, and record-keeping. Their work supported taxation, trade, labor organization, religious ceremonies, and government administration. A stable civilization depends heavily on records. Egypt kept records constantly. Grain supplies. Land boundaries. Work assignments. Religious offerings. Population counts. Storage inventories. The simple act of writing things down helped maintain continuity across enormous stretches of time. Inside administrative buildings, scribes worked in rooms that smelled faintly of papyrus, ink, sweat, and dust. Light entered through small openings while flies drifted lazily through warm air. Young apprentice scribes practiced symbols repeatedly onto broken pottery pieces while older officials checked calculations carefully beside wooden desks. Their lives were quieter than those of laborers, but not necessarily easy. Long hours bent over writing surfaces caused pain in the neck and back. Eyes strained in dim light. Mistakes could bring punishment or shame. Still, many families hoped their sons might become scribes because literacy offered a path away from constant physical labor. Most people, though, remained tied directly to the land. The Nile Valley moved according to farming seasons. Planting. Growing. Harvesting. Storage. Then flooding once again. This dependable agricultural cycle created psychological stability as much as economic stability. People understood their place within the yearly rhythm. Even children participated early. Young girls carried water jars from wells or riverbanks. Boys helped herd animals through fields or collected reeds for weaving. Older relatives taught tasks patiently because survival depended on knowledge passing smoothly from one generation into the next. There was comfort in repetition. Morning bread prepared the same way every day. Fishing nets repaired beside the same riverbanks. Songs sung quietly during work. The sound of sandals against familiar stone streets. At sunset, many workers simply sat outside their homes resting silently while evening winds cooled the land. Ancient Egypt could be loud during daylight hours. Markets filled with bargaining voices. Donkeys brayed. Hammers struck wood and stone. Children shouted while running through narrow streets. But nighttime brought another world entirely. Oil lamps flickered softly behind small windows. Families spoke quietly together before sleep. The river moved almost silently through darkness. Far away in the desert, jackals sometimes called beneath the stars. And above all of it stood the immense silence of the ancient landscape itself. Deserts have a strange stillness at night. Heat slowly leaves the ground. Wind softens. Sounds travel farther. People become aware of distance. Egypt must have felt enormous beneath the night sky, yet also strangely intimate along the narrow river where nearly everyone lived. This closeness mattered. Most people lived near one another because survival required cooperation around water, farming, irrigation, transport, and trade. Communities formed tightly connected networks where routines became deeply shared. Neighbors knew each other's schedules. Everyone understood the flood seasons. People gathered during religious festivals tied to agricultural cycles. Shared expectations create social calm. And Egypt excelled at preserving shared expectations. Even rulers understood the importance of continuity. Pharaohs changed over centuries, but the broader structure of Egyptian life often remained surprisingly familiar beneath new leadership. Kings presented themselves not as destroyers of old systems but as protectors of order itself. Maintaining balance became a sacred duty. The ruler's role connected directly to the stability of the cosmos, the flooding river, the harvests, and the peace of the land. Whether ordinary farmers fully believed every royal claim is difficult to know, but the overall message reinforced something important: stability was valuable, sacred, and worth protecting. This belief entered daily life in quiet ways. A farmer repairing irrigation channels beside neighbors was participating in the same social order praised inside temples. A scribe balancing grain accounts supported the same idea of harmony celebrated by priests. A mother baking bread before sunrise contributed to household stability within the larger rhythm of Egyptian life. Tiny repeated actions built enormous continuity over time. Of course, Egypt was not peaceful every moment. There were periods of unrest. Poor harvests. Political struggles. Corruption. Local violence. Disease. Exhaustion. Human life remained difficult and fragile. But remarkably often, the civilization recovered and returned to familiar patterns. The river helped make this possible. Transportation along the Nile remained efficient compared to travel across harsh deserts. Boats carried grain, stone, workers, messages, animals, and goods between settlements spread across long distances. The current flowed north while prevailing winds often allowed boats to sail south. This natural transportation system connected Egypt together like a long-moving road of water. Travelers drifting along the Nile would pass endless scenes of daily life. Women washing clothing near muddy banks. Children splashing in shallow water. Palm trees bending gently above villages. Cattle drinking beside reeds. Fishing boats rocking softly at dawn. Temple columns rising pale in morning sunlight. The visual continuity of the river itself may have strengthened the feeling that Egypt was eternal. Every generation saw the same flowing water. The same flood cycles. The same stars reflected at night. For ordinary people, this constancy shaped the emotional experience of life. And so the civilization endured. Not because every ruler was wise. Not because every year was prosperous. But because millions of ordinary routines continued steadily across centuries. Morning bread. River water. Field labor. Writing records. Repairing walls. Lighting lamps. Sleeping beside warm mud-brick walls while the Nile drifted quietly through darkness nearby. Far into the night, Egypt breathed slowly beside the river. And before dawn arrived once more, Countless workers already stirred softly from sleep, preparing again for another familiar day beneath the ancient sun. Before the first light reached the horizon, the river villages were already beginning to wake again. The darkness over the Nile had softened into a deep blue-gray color. Stars slowly disappeared one by one above the desert hills. Cool air drifted low across the water, carrying the smell of wet reeds and mud from the riverbanks. Inside a small house near the edge of a farming village, a woman quietly rose from her sleeping mat while the rest of the family still slept beside her. The room was dark except for the faint orange glow of dying embers in a clay oven. Ash rested softly across the floor near the fire pit. Clay jars lined the wall in careful rows. A woven basket filled with onions and coarse grain sat beside a wooden stool worn smooth from years of use. She moved carefully through the room without speaking. Outside, somewhere beyond the narrow streets, another household was waking too. Then another. And another. Ancient Egypt often began its mornings in silence. People did not rush the way many societies later would. The heat of the day was still far away. Workers moved slowly at first, conserving energy for the long hours ahead. Sandals scraped softly across packed earth floors. Water jars clinked quietly. Doors made from reeds and wood creaked open into cool morning air. Soon smoke began rising above the village. Bread was one of the centerpieces of Egyptian life. Every day, grain had to be prepared, crushed, mixed, shaped, and baked. The process never truly ended. Families consumed enormous amounts of bread because it provided much of the energy needed for physical labor beneath the sun. Many women spent several hours each day preparing food. The work was repetitive and exhausting in ways that slowly shaped the body over time. Kneeling beside grinding stones wore down joints. Carrying heavy jars strained the spine. Smoke from indoor fires irritated the lungs and eyes. Yet these quiet domestic routines formed part of the invisible foundation beneath Egyptian stability. People survived because households functioned steadily. A civilization does not remain stable for centuries only through kings and armies. It survives because ordinary people continue waking before sunrise to prepare meals, repair clothing, care for children, and organize daily life with patience and endurance. As dawn spread slowly across the Nile Valley, the river itself began to change color. Dark blue turned silver. Then pale gold. Long narrow boats drifted away from shore while fishermen prepared their nets in silence. Some stood barefoot in shallow water, feeling soft mud between their toes as tiny fish brushed through reeds nearby. The river was calm this morning. Most mornings, it was calm. That mattered deeply to the Egyptian mind. Predictability brings comfort to human beings. The Nile rarely surprised people completely. Its flooding seasons followed familiar rhythms known across generations. Farmers understood when water would begin rising. Priests tracked patterns carefully. Officials measured flood levels using carved stone markers because the height of the water could determine the prosperity of the coming year. When the floods were healthy, anxiety softened across the land. Workers felt safer. Families stored grain more confidently. Trade became smoother. Taxes could be paid. Temples remained supplied. The entire civilization rested emotionally upon the behavior of the river. Even children learned early to watch the Nile carefully. A boy walking beside his father at sunrise might pause to examine wet soil left behind after flooding. Dark earth meant fertility. Healthy crops. Enough food for the household. Enough grain for storage jars. Enough bread for another year. These were not abstract concerns. Hunger always remained close in the ancient world. A few failed harvests could weaken entire regions very quickly. Malnutrition spread quietly through poor communities. Illness became more dangerous when food supplies declined. Parents worried constantly about grain levels and water conditions because survival depended upon them. Yet Egypt experienced long periods when these fears remained manageable rather than overwhelming. The Nile provided enough consistency to allow society to grow layered and organized. Large temple systems emerged. Government offices expanded. Trade networks developed. Craft specialization increased. People could dedicate themselves to pottery, carpentry, weaving, administration, or religious service because enough food usually existed to support workers outside direct farming labor. This gradual specialization strengthened stability further. In one district near the river, potters already worked while the sky was still pale with early morning light. Their workshop smelled strongly of wet clay and smoke. Finished jars stood stacked carefully against mud brick walls while apprentices carried fresh water from nearby canals. Pottery wheels spun steadily beneath practiced hands. Clay pressed upward slowly into bowls, jars, cups, and storage containers. Egypt relied heavily on containers. Grain storage, oil storage, water transport, beer brewing, food preservation. A stable society needs systems for storing resources safely over time, and Egyptian pottery helped make this possible. Thousands upon thousands of clay vessels passed through homes, markets, temples, workshops, and government storerooms every year. Ordinary objects supported extraordinary continuity. Nearby, a donkey cart rolled slowly through the village road. Dust lifted softly beneath wooden wheels. The driver sat quietly beneath the growing warmth of sunrise while sacks of grain shifted behind him. Flies gathered around the animal's eyes. Somewhere close, a baby cried briefly before becoming quiet again. The village was fully awake now. Children carried baskets. Women swept floors with bundles of reeds. Older men sat repairing tools outside shaded doorways. Workers prepared for the long heat ahead. The Egyptian day revolved around the movement of the sun. By midday, temperatures could become punishing. Laborers often tried to complete the hardest physical work during earlier morning hours while the air remained more bearable. Even so, exhaustion shaped daily life constantly. Sweat-soaked linen clothing. Skin cracked beneath dry heat. Feet blistered from walking rough roads. Workers rested whenever brief opportunities appeared. This rhythm of labor and rest became deeply understood across society. A farmer in ancient Egypt likely knew fatigue intimately from childhood onward. After sunrise, teams moved into the fields carrying wooden tools worn smooth through years of use. Some guided oxen through soft earth while others cleared irrigation channels clogged by mud or reeds. The work demanded patience more than speed. Nothing in Egypt moved especially fast. Boats drifted slowly. Floodwaters rose gradually. Stone buildings took decades to complete. Even communication across the kingdom traveled at the pace of walking feet, river currents, or sails catching warm wind. This slower rhythm may have helped reinforce stability too. Change arrived gently for many people. Generations passed before major transformations became fully visible in ordinary life. A farmer could spend his entire existence working much like his father and grandfather before him. Familiarity became deeply rooted in the emotional structure of society. And yet, Egypt was never completely frozen in time. Markets brought movement and exchange into daily life. By late morning, trading areas in larger settlements filled with activity. Merchants spread goods across woven mats beneath shaded awnings. Fish lay drying in the sun beside baskets of vegetables and jars of beer. Linen cloth fluttered lightly in warm air. Copper tools glinted softly beneath sunlight filtering through dust. The sounds of markets were steady rather than frantic. Low conversations. Bargaining voices. Animals shifting restlessly. Footsteps over packed earth. The scrape of pottery being moved. People came not only to trade but also to share information. News traveled slowly through human conversation carried from village to village along the Nile. Travelers arriving by boat brought stories of flood conditions, harvest quality, taxes, temple ceremonies, and royal announcements from distant regions. Most people rarely traveled far from home. The Nile connected Egypt, but ordinary laborers often spent their entire lives within a relatively small stretch of land. Their world centered around familiar fields, familiar neighbors, familiar waterways. This local stability created powerful social bonds. Families relied heavily on community support during illness, flood damage, or poor harvests. Neighbors shared labor repairing homes after storms. Relatives cared for children collectively. Rituals surrounding birth, marriage, and death strengthened continuity across generations. Death itself existed very close to everyday life. Illnesses that seem minor today could become deadly in the ancient world. Infections spread easily. Medical knowledge remained limited. Hard physical labor weakened bodies over time. Many workers suffered chronic pain, damaged joints, or untreated injuries. Yet even in the presence of death, Egyptian society developed remarkably stable emotional frameworks. Religion played an enormous role here. The Egyptians viewed life and death not as separate worlds but as connected parts of a larger ongoing existence. The setting sun each evening symbolized death and renewal together. The Nile floods represented destruction and rebirth at the same time. Seeds buried beneath soil emerged again as crops. Cycles were everywhere. And cycles feel stable. Inside temples, priests maintained rituals that mirrored these repeating natural patterns. Ceremonies followed careful routines unchanged for long periods. Sacred words were spoken precisely. Offerings appeared daily before statues of the gods. Incense smoke drifted upward through cool stone halls while sunlight slowly moved across carved columns. For ordinary people, temples represented permanence. Massive stone walls outlasted generations. Even poor laborers could look upon temple buildings and feel surrounded by something enduring and ordered. The structures themselves communicated stability through sheer weight and age. Stone changes slowly. An Egypt built with stone whenever permanence mattered most. Far from the temples, however, most people continued living inside fragile mud-brick homes constantly needing repair. Wind and weather gradually wore walls down. Floodwaters sometimes damaged foundations. Roofs required maintenance. Daily labor extended far beyond fields into endless household upkeep. A woman might spend her afternoon patching cracked walls with fresh mud while children played nearby in dusty streets. An older man repaired fishing nets beneath the shade of a date palm. A teenage boy carried water repeatedly from the river until his shoulders ached. These ordinary scenes repeated across Egypt thousands upon thousands of times. This repetition became civilization itself. Not grand ceremonies alone. Not royal tombs alone. But daily routines continuing reliably across generations. Even Egyptian time felt deeply connected to repetition. The rising sun. The flood season. The harvest. The cooling evening. The return of stars. The people of Egypt lived close to natural rhythms in ways that shaped their emotional world profoundly. Artificial light remained limited. Most activity followed daylight closely. Nights became periods of rest, storytelling, prayer, quiet conversation, or simple silence. After sunset, villages softened again. Cooking fires glowed warmly behind small doorways. The smell of bread and onions drifted through cooling air. Workers sat outside resting sore muscles while darkness slowly settled across the Nile Valley. Children listened to older relatives tell stories beneath the stars. Some tales spoke of gods. Others spoke of ancestors or local memories carried through generations. Oral storytelling helped preserve cultural continuity long before written records reached everyone. Shared stories create shared identity, and Egypt maintained strong cultural identity for astonishing lengths of time. Even clothing remained relatively consistent across centuries. Simple linen garments suited the climate well. Workers often wore minimal clothing during extreme heat. Wealthier individuals used finer fabrics, jewelry, and cosmetics, but daily practical life for ordinary laborers remained grounded in physical necessity rather than luxury. The climate itself encouraged continuity. Egypt's environment changed less dramatically from season to season than colder regions farther north. The sun remained powerful. The river remained central. Agricultural cycles repeated with dependable familiarity. And surrounding deserts acted almost like protective walls. Large invasions into Egypt were difficult partly because the landscape around the fertile Nile corridor was harsh and unforgiving. Deserts limited movement. Armies crossing them faced enormous logistical problems involving water, food, and heat. This geographic protection gave Egypt long periods of relative security. Communities could focus more energy on maintaining internal systems rather than constantly rebuilding after invasions. Trade still connected Egypt to neighboring regions, but the civilization benefited from natural barriers that reduced sudden external disruptions. Security allows routines to deepen. When people feel relatively safe from immediate destruction, they invest more energy into long-term systems. Irrigation channels, granaries, administrative records, temples, roads, craft traditions, education. Egypt developed all of these patiently over time. Nothing about this stability meant life felt easy for ordinary workers. Many people likely ended each day completely exhausted. Bodies worn down. Hands roughened. Feet aching. Skin coated in dust and sweat. A laborer returning home after sunset might sit quietly for a long time before speaking. The simple relief of cooler evening air could feel deeply comforting after hours beneath the blazing sun. Nearby, bread baked slowly over open heat. Children drifted toward sleep. The river moved softly through darkness once again. And somewhere far away, priests inside temple walls continued their nighttime rituals beneath flickering oil lamps while scribes finished records by dim light. Egypt never fully stopped moving. Even at night, someone was repairing nets. Someone was watching animals. Someone was grinding grain for morning bread. Someone was traveling slowly along the Nile beneath the stars. The civilization endured because countless ordinary people kept performing these quiet tasks over and over again with patient endurance. Generation after generation. Century after century. And above them all, the warm desert wind moved softly across the dark riverbanks while ancient Egypt settled once more into another calm and familiar night. Along the eastern edge of the Nile, the first pale light of another morning slowly touched the tops of the palm trees. The river remained quiet. Mist drifted low above the water in thin silver layers while fishing boats floated almost motionless near the shore. Somewhere in the distance, an oar dipped softly into the river with a slow and careful rhythm. Most of the world beyond Egypt still slept in darkness. But here beside the Nile, another long day was already beginning. Inside narrow homes built from mud brick and reeds, families slowly stirred awake beneath the fading coolness of night. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Older workers stretched stiff backs and sore knees before standing. A few oil lamps still glowed faintly near walls blackened by years of cooking smoke. The air smelled of dust, ashes, and bread dough. A woman knelt beside a low grinding stone while the sky outside slowly brightened. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm over the grain. Back and forth. Back and forth. The sound was soft but steady. Like many people in Egypt, she had likely learned this work as a small child beside her mother. Some tasks in ancient Egypt never truly changed. That sameness helped create stability across generations. People understood their roles clearly from a young age. A fisherman's son learned the river. A farmer's daughter learned the household rhythms of grain, bread, water, and storage. Children watched adults carefully because survival depended on learning practical routines long before adulthood arrived. There were few surprises in daily village life. And for many people, that predictability felt comforting. The Nile itself taught patience. Nothing important happened quickly beside the river. Floodwaters rose slowly over weeks. Crops matured gradually beneath the sun. Boats drifted at the speed of wind and current. Even large temple projects unfolded across entire lifetimes. This slow pace shaped the emotional feeling of Egyptian civilization. Life moved like the river itself. Steady. Repetitive. Enduring. As sunrise spread across the valley, workers stepped into the growing warmth of morning. Sandals pressed softly into dirt roads already marked by thousands of footsteps. Donkeys carried baskets of grain through narrow streets. Dogs wandered between homes searching for scraps. Thin smoke climbed upward into the pale sky from early cooking fires. The village was alive now. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared long nets weighted with stone and bone. Some stood quietly repairing tiers from the previous day's work while others checked woven traps placed in shallow water overnight. Fishing demanded patience more than strength. Hours passed slowly beside the Nile. The water carried endless small sounds. Gentle waves against wooden boats. Reeds brushing together in the wind. Birds calling from muddy banks. Insects humming over still water beneath the growing heat of the sun. For fishermen, much of life was waiting. Waiting for movement in the nets. Waiting for the changing seasons. Waiting for flood waters. Waiting for evening winds that cooled the skin after long hours beneath open sunlight. Ancient Egypt was filled with waiting. And perhaps that waiting helped create calm. The people of Egypt lived close to cycles they could not rush. Crops would grow when ready. Floods would come when they came. Children would slowly become adults beneath the same sun that had watched countless earlier generations work the same fields. Farther inland, farmers were already moving toward the agricultural land beyond the village. The earth near the Nile looked dark and fertile compared to the pale desert beyond it. Irrigation channels carried precious water into fields where workers bent beneath the early morning light planting, cutting, digging, and carrying. The work was endless. Even during successful years, farming demanded constant labor. Canals clogged with mud and reeds needed clearing. Storage jars needed protection from moisture and pests. Animals required feeding and care. Crops had to be watched carefully for signs of disease or poor growth. The entire agricultural system depended upon cooperation. Villages worked together because they had to. One damaged canal could affect many families. Shared labor became part of survival itself. Men gathered to repair irrigation walls after flood seasons. Neighbors helped lift heavy grain sacks during harvests. Older workers passed practical knowledge to younger hands patiently and repeatedly. These routines strengthened trust between people. Stable societies often depend less on individual greatness and more on ordinary cooperation repeated over very long periods of time. Egypt understood this deeply, even if few people would have spoken about it in abstract ways. They simply lived it every day. Under the rising heat of the sun, labor crews moved through the fields with slow determination. Linen clothing darkened with sweat. Flies gathered around workers and animals. Dust clung to skin already roughened by years of physical work. By midday, exhaustion settled heavily across the land. The Egyptian sun could feel immense. Heat shimmered above roads and rooftops. Stone walls radiated warmth back into the air. Workers paused whenever possible beneath patches of shade cast by trees, boats, or mud-brick buildings. Rest mattered. Without moments of stillness, bodies simply could not endure the demands of daily life. In one small farming settlement, several laborers sat quietly beside a canal sharing bread and beer from clay jars while resting during the hottest part of the afternoon. Beer in ancient Egypt was thick, nourishing, and common. It was consumed daily by many people because it provided calories and hydration in a world where clean water could not always be trusted. Workers often received bread and beer as payment for labor. The smell of brewing grain drifted constantly through villages and cities alike. Simple food sustained the civilization. Bread, beer, onions, fish, beans, dates. Sometimes meat during festivals or special occasions. Meals were rarely luxurious for ordinary workers, but regular food supplies helped maintain social stability. Hunger creates unrest very quickly. Egypt's agricultural system, supported by the Nile's predictable flooding, allowed large populations to remain fed more consistently than many neighboring regions. Of course, shortages still happened. There were years when floodwaters arrived too low. Years when crops struggled. Years when grain storage failed to meet demand. During such times, anxiety spread quietly through the population. Parents worried over dwindling food jars. Officials recorded supplies carefully. Temples distributed emergency grain when possible. But remarkably often, Egypt recovered. The river returned. The fields produced again. Life resumed familiar patterns. This ability to return to normal after hardship became one of the civilization's greatest strengths. Stability does not mean the absence of problems. It means systems are strong enough to absorb difficulties without completely collapsing. And Egypt possessed many stabilizing systems working together at once. The river, agriculture, religion, administration, tradition, community labor, geographic protection, shared cultural identity. All these layers reinforced one another slowly over centuries. Meanwhile, in larger cities farther north and south along the Nile, another kind of labor filled the day. Craft workers crowded into workshops heavy with heat and noise. Carpenters shaped wooden furniture beneath drifting sawdust. Goldsmiths bent carefully over delicate jewelry illuminated by shafts of sunlight through small windows. Linen weavers worked beside large wooden looms while dyed fabric hung drying nearby in warm air. Cities smelled different from villages. More smoke. More animals. More human bodies pressed closely together. More waste beneath the heat. Yet cities also brought opportunity. Trade expanded there. Skilled workers could sometimes improve their position through craftsmanship or government service. Scribes especially occupied an important place inside urban life. A young apprentice scribe might spend long hours inside a quiet schoolroom copying symbols onto broken pottery fragments while teachers corrected mistakes sternly nearby. Writing demanded patience and discipline. The Egyptian writing system was complex and time-consuming to master. Students memorized signs carefully through endless repetition. Reed pens scratched softly across papyrus while flies buzzed lazily through hot rooms. Most people never learned to read. Because of this, scribes held unusual power within society. They organized taxes, tracked labor, recorded harvests, managed storage systems, prepared official documents. A civilization that keeps records carefully can preserve continuity far more effectively than one relying only on memory. Egyptian administration became remarkably sophisticated for the ancient world. Officials measured fields after floods altered land boundaries. Grain levels were counted and documented. Workforces for large projects were organized systematically rather than chaotically. This administrative order reduced instability. People understood expectations more clearly. Taxes could feel burdensome, certainly, but predictable systems often create less fear than random ones. Egypt's bureaucracy, slow and imperfect as it was, helped maintain continuity across enormous stretches of time. Even royal authority depended partly on this organized structure. Far away from ordinary villages, pharaohs ruled from palaces surrounded by officials, guards, servants, priests, and advisors. Yet most ordinary Egyptians rarely encountered royal power directly. Instead, they experienced it through taxes, labor requirements, temple systems, and local administrators. And importantly, royal power usually presented itself as protective rather than chaotic. Egyptian rulers emphasized order constantly. Maintaining harmony between people, gods, nature, and the state became part of the entire political philosophy of the civilization. Stability itself carried spiritual meaning. The king was expected to preserve balance. If crops failed repeatedly or unrest spread widely, people often interpreted these problems as signs that cosmic order itself had weakened. This connection between government and sacred balance strengthened social continuity because preserving the system became morally important, not merely practical. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued quietly beneath these larger ideas. Children still chased one another through dusty streets. Women still carried water jars balanced carefully against their hips. Old men still sat outside homes repairing tools while watching village life pass slowly by. At sunset, the heat finally began to soften again. Long shadows stretched across the Nile Valley. Palm trees sway gently above irrigation canals glowing gold beneath evening light. Workers returned home slowly with tired bodies and dust-covered feet. Evening was often the gentlest part of the day. The air cooled little by little. Bird calls softened. Animals settled. Cooking fires flickered outside homes while the smell of roasting fish and fresh bread drifted through narrow streets. Families gathered together again after long hours of separation. Some sat on rooftops to catch cooler breezes. Others rested near doorways watching darkness slowly spread across the village. There was no rush. Night arrived gradually in ancient Egypt. The stars returned one at a time above the desert. Temple music drifted faintly from distant ceremonial grounds. Priests moved through shadowed halls carrying oil lamps while sacred chants echoed softly against enormous stone columns. Elsewhere, along quiet stretches of riverbank, fishermen prepared for nighttime work beneath moonlight reflecting across black water. The Nile never fully slept. Boats still moved slowly through darkness carrying grain, stone, papyrus, pottery, and travelers between settlements. River traffic connected Egypt together continuously like blood moving through a living body. Without the Nile, Egypt would likely have scattered into isolated desert communities. With it, the civilization remained connected, unified, predictable, shared. This geographic unity mattered tremendously. Many ancient societies fractured because regions became disconnected from one another during crises. Egypt's river helped maintain communication, transport, and cultural cohesion even across long distances. People in distant parts of the kingdom still depended upon the same river, still followed similar agricultural cycles, still worshipped many of the same gods, still recognized the same broad social order. And so the civilization held together through centuries that would have shattered many others. Late into the night, after families drifted into sleep, Egypt became quiet once more. Only a few sounds remained. Water brushing softly against the riverbank. Wind moving through reeds. A distant animal call from somewhere beyond the fields. Inside cool temple chambers, a final oil lamp flickered against carved stone before darkness settled completely. And under the endless stars above the Nile Valley, the people of ancient Egypt rested again inside the familiar rhythms that had guided their world for generations beyond memory. The night over the Nile was deep and still. Moonlight rested softly across the water, turning the slow-moving river into a long ribbon of silver beneath the stars. The desert beyond the fertile land seemed endless in the darkness. Quiet hills of sand and stone stretched outward into silence where almost nothing moved except the wind. Most villages were asleep now. Inside small mud-brick homes, families rested close together beneath woven blankets and linen cloth. The air inside the houses remained warm from the heat stored in the walls during the day. Children slept beside parents and grandparents. A baby stirred softly somewhere in the darkness before settling again. Outside, the world felt calm. The heavy noise of labor had faded. No hammering workshops. No crowded markets. No shouting from the fields. Only the slow breathing of Egypt at rest. This quietness returned every night for centuries. And perhaps this steady return to calm helped people feel that the world itself was stable and dependable. No matter how exhausting the day had been, darkness always arrived slowly over the Nile. Cool air followed. Lamps were lit. Bread was shared. Families rested together while tomorrow waited patiently beyond the horizon. Long before dawn, however, some people were already awake. Near a riverside dock, a small group of boatmen prepared for travel beneath fading moonlight. Their sandals pressed softly against damp wood while ropes creaked quietly against moored boats. One man carried jars of grain wrapped carefully in linen cloth. Another checked bundles of papyrus tied tightly for transport northward along the river. Trade along the Nile rarely stopped completely. Even at night, movement continued. Egypt's stability depended partly on this constant flow of goods between villages, cities, temples, and ports. Grain moved from farming regions into storage centers. Stone traveled toward construction sites. Copper tools passed from craftsmen into markets. Fish, oil, cloth, wood, and pottery drifted slowly through the kingdom aboard narrow river boats. The Nile connected people who might never meet one another. A farmer in the south could help feed workers far away in a northern city without ever seeing their faces. A stonecutter near distant quarries could shape materials that would someday stand in temples hundreds of miles away. The river carried not only goods but continuity itself. And because transport along the Nile remained relatively reliable, Egypt developed strong systems of organization over time. At the edge of another village farther inland, an elderly farmer woke before sunrise as he had done almost every day of his life. His knees hurt when he stood. His hands were rough and permanently hardened from decades of labor. Fine lines marked his face from years beneath the bright Egyptian sun. Yet his morning routine remained familiar enough to perform almost without thought. He stepped outside slowly into the cool darkness. The stars above the fields still burned clearly. Palm leaves shifted gently overhead. Nearby animals stirred inside simple enclosures made from wood and reeds. He listened for a moment. In ancient Egypt, people listened carefully to the world around them. They listened for flood waters, for changes in the wind, for animal sounds during the night, for approaching footsteps on quiet roads. Without modern noise surrounding them, small sounds carried meaning. The river itself spoke constantly through soft movement against mud and reeds. Soon the horizon began turning pale again. Another day approached. And with it came another cycle of labor repeated so many times across Egyptian history that entire generations lived and died within almost identical rhythms. This repetition formed the deep heartbeat of the civilization. Not dramatic moments. Not constant change. But daily continuity. As dawn spread slowly across the valley, workers emerged from homes carrying baskets, ropes, wooden tools, and water jars. The smell of smoke returned as ovens warmed for baking. Dust rose softly beneath moving feet. Children were already helping. Ancient Egypt depended heavily on family labor. Even very young children carried small responsibilities within the household economy. They collected fuel for fires, helped prepare food, watched younger siblings, carried water, or assisted with animals. Life began teaching responsibility early. Few people had the luxury of idleness. Survival depended on steady work shared across the household. Yet despite the hardship, there were also moments of closeness and familiarity that gave emotional warmth to daily life. A mother humming softly while kneading bread dough. Brothers laughing quietly while carrying fishing nets. Neighbors exchanging food beside a shaded doorway. Workers resting together near the river after long hours in the heat. Human beings adapt to difficult conditions when routines feel meaningful and shared. Egypt's stability came partly from this shared participation in daily survival. People understood one another's burdens because nearly everyone labored physically in some form. Heat, fatigue, hunger, dust, and sore muscles were common experiences across much of society. Even skilled craftsmen faced exhausting schedules. Inside a crowded stone workshop near a temple construction site, masons were already at work by early morning. The sound of carving echoed steadily through the air. Tap. Pause. Tap again. Fine white dust coated their arms and clothing. Some workers crouched beside massive stone blocks while others smoothed carved surfaces using abrasive sand and patient repetition. The labor demanded precision and endurance together. Large construction projects in Egypt often lasted many years. Sometimes decades. Sometimes longer than a single worker's lifetime. A man might spend his entire career helping build one temple wall, knowing he would never see the project fully completed. Yet work continued steadily because Egyptian society valued permanence more than speed. Stone structures were designed to endure. Temples, tombs, statues, and monuments connected generations together physically. Children grew up seeing the same immense buildings their grandparents had known. These lasting structures reinforced the feeling that Egypt itself was eternal. Permanence surrounded people constantly. The river returned. The temples endured. The stars remained unchanged. And so ordinary workers often believed their civilization would continue forever. Inside the temples themselves, another kind of routine unfolded every day with careful order. Priests moved quietly through cool stone corridors carrying incense burners, oil lamps, and offerings. The smell inside temple halls was heavy with smoke, flowers, oils, and warm stone. Temple life followed strict schedules. Sacred statues were washed and dressed. Prayers were spoken. Offerings were presented. Hymns echoed softly against towering columns carved with images of gods, kings, birds, reeds, and flowing water. The ceremonies changed little over time. This consistency mattered deeply. Religious repetition creates emotional security. Familiar rituals reassure people that the world remains ordered and understandable. In Egypt, religion was woven directly into everyday existence rather than separated from it. The rising sun carried sacred meaning. The Nile floods carried sacred meaning. Even farming itself connected to divine order. Ordinary workers may not have understood every complex theological idea taught inside temple schools, but they understood that balance and continuity were sacred values. Chaos frightened people because chaos threatened survival. A failed flood could bring hunger. Political unrest could disrupt irrigation systems. War could interrupt trade and harvests. The Egyptians feared disorder not only physically but spiritually. So much of their civilization focused on preserving balance. And for long stretches of time, they succeeded remarkably well. By midday, heat covered the Nile Valley once again. The air became thick and bright. Workers wrapped linen around their heads against the sun. Animals crowded beneath small areas of shade. Even insects seemed slower beneath the heavy warmth pressing down from above. Many laborers paused briefly during the hottest hours. Some sat silently beside canals with their feet in cool water. Others rested against mud-brick walls eating simple meals of bread, onions, or dried fish. Sweat dried slowly on tired skin while distant birds circled above the river. Fatigue was a permanent companion in ancient Egypt. Bodies aged quickly beneath constant physical strain. By middle age, many workers likely suffered from damaged joints, worn teeth from coarse bread filled with tiny grains of stone dust, and chronic pain from lifting, grinding, carrying, and bending. Yet life continued steadily despite these hardships. That endurance became part of the civilization's strength. People expected labor, expected discomfort, expected repetition. And because expectations matched reality, society remained psychologically stable in ways many modern worlds are not. The rhythms of Egypt felt understandable. Morning work, midday heat, evening rest, flooding seasons, harvest seasons, temple festivals, the return of cool night air. Again and again. Generation after generation. In larger towns, government officials continued recording the movement of goods and labor throughout the afternoon. Inside administrative buildings, scribes worked carefully beside stacks of papyrus scrolls and wooden tablets. Some counted grain deliveries. Others recorded tax obligations or tracked labor crews assigned to public works projects. Writing helped Egypt remember itself. Records preserved continuity beyond individual memory. When one official died, another could continue using the same stored information. Knowledge survived across generations through careful documentation. This stability of administration mattered enormously. Many civilizations collapse when institutions fail to pass knowledge forward reliably. Egypt developed systems strong enough to survive the deaths of countless individual rulers, officials, priests, and workers. The broader structure endured. Partly because records endured. As afternoon slowly faded toward evening, shadows lengthened across the fields. The worst heat finally softened. Workers began returning toward villages carrying tools over tired shoulders. Boats drifted homeward through golden light reflecting across the Nile. Children ran through dusty roads while animals kicked up clouds of pale earth behind them. The evening meal became another important daily ritual. Families gathered together again after separation during the day's labor. Bread was broken. Beer poured slowly into cups. Fish roasted over small fires while smoke drifted upward into darkening skies. Conversations remained simple. Crop conditions. Family concerns. Village news. Temple festivals. River levels. The ordinary details of survival. For many people, this quiet evening togetherness may have been the emotional center of life itself. Not kings. Not monuments. But shared rest after labor. A chance to sit beneath cooling skies while exhaustion slowly eased from the body. And above them all, the ancient stars returned once more over Egypt. Clear. Steady. Familiar. The same constellations watched generations pass beside the Nile without hurry. Night insects sang softly from the reeds. Water touched the riverbanks in gentle rhythms. Somewhere in the darkness, a distant flute played quietly before fading into silence again. And so another day in ancient Egypt slowly disappeared into night, carried gently forward by the same enduring rhythms that had held the civilization together for centuries beside the calm and patient river. Before dawn returned to the Nile Valley, the land rested beneath a heavy silence. The river moved slowly through darkness, wide and calm beneath the stars. Cool air drifted across the water and through the reeds lining the banks. Far out in the desert, beyond the green strip of life beside the Nile, the night remained empty and still. In the villages, only a few faint lamps still glowed. Most homes were dark now. Families slept closely together on woven mats stuffed with straw or reeds. Some rested on rooftops beneath the open sky where the night breeze felt cooler against tired skin. Others slept inside narrow rooms where clay walls still held warmth from the long day before. A worker's body in ancient Egypt rarely felt fully rested. Muscles remained sore from lifting, grinding, carrying, rowing, digging, or bending beneath the sun. Hands hardened over years of labor. Feet cracked from rough roads and hot ground. Yet every morning, people rose again because the rhythm of life allowed little choice. The Nile continued. And so the people continued too. Slowly, the eastern horizon began to pale once more. The stars faded gently above the river. Birds stirred inside palm trees. Somewhere near a riverside dock, a fisherman untied a rope from a wooden post while water brushed softly against the side of his narrow boat. Another day was beginning. And like countless mornings before it, the beginning came quietly. There were no loud bells calling people awake across Egypt. No sudden noise broke the darkness. Instead, the civilization awakened gradually, almost like breathing. One household at a time. One cooking fire at a time. One pair of sandals touching the floor at a time. In a farming village farther south, a young boy followed his father through the cool early light toward the fields beside an irrigation canal. The earth beneath their feet still felt damp from the river water drawn through narrow channels during the night. Frogs slipped quietly into the water as they passed. The smell of wet soil rose softly into the air. The boy carried a small basket. His father carried heavier tools across his shoulders worn smooth from years of use. Neither spoke very much. Ancient Egyptian life often contained long periods of quiet work. People spent hours concentrating on physical tasks that required rhythm and patience more than conversation. The sounds around them became familiar companions instead. The splash of water. The scrape of wood against earth. Birds circling overhead. Wind through reeds. Oxen breathing heavily beside plows. These sounds formed part of daily existence for generations. As sunlight slowly spread across the fields, other workers appeared in the distance. Small figures moved steadily through the growing brightness carrying baskets, ropes, grain sacks, and farming tools. Everyone understood what needed to be done. This shared understanding helped Egypt remain stable over very long periods of time. Most people knew their responsibilities clearly. Farming seasons guided labor naturally. Flood cycles organized the agricultural calendar. Communities cooperated because survival depended upon it. There was comfort in knowing what tomorrow would likely require. Many societies struggle when uncertainty becomes constant. Egypt, by comparison, offered long stretches of predictability shaped by geography and tradition together. The river rose. The river fell. Crops were planted. Harvests were gathered. Storage jars were filled. The same cycle repeated endlessly beneath the sun. By early morning, villages across the Nile Valley had become fully active. Smoke drifted above rooftops. Children carried water from canals and wells. Women prepared bread beside warm clay ovens. Donkeys pulled carts through narrow dusty roads while merchants arranged goods beneath shaded market stalls. The smells of Egypt returned with the daylight. Fresh bread. River mud. Sweat. Smoke. Fish drying in the sun. Animal dung. Warm reeds near the water's edge. Life beside the Nile was deeply physical. Nothing remained clean for very long. Dust settled over everything. Heat drew sweat from the body constantly. Sand entered homes, clothing, food, and tools. Workers washed when possible, but the environment itself shaped daily life through endless contact with earth, water, and sun. Even wealthier Egyptians lived close to the natural world in ways difficult to imagine now. The Nile touched everything. The river determined planting seasons, transportation routes, food supplies, taxes, trade, religion, and even emotional expectations about stability itself. People trusted the Nile because for countless generations it had sustained life with remarkable consistency. This trust allowed Egypt to organize itself calmly over time. In larger agricultural regions, officials traveled periodically to inspect fields and estimate harvest yields. Scribes followed beside them carrying writing tools, papyrus rolls, and wooden pallets filled with ink. Their work was slow and careful. Measurements mattered. The state depended heavily on grain collection and distribution. Grain-fed labor crews, supported temples, paid workers, and sustained cities during poor seasons. Without organized agricultural management, Egyptian stability would have weakened quickly. Inside storage buildings near the fields, workers poured harvested grain into enormous clay containers while scribes recorded quantities nearby. Dust filled the air. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Flies gathered around the workers' faces as they lifted heavy baskets again and again throughout the day. This labor could be exhausting beyond words. Yet because it followed familiar routines, people learned to endure it psychologically. Human beings tolerate hardship more easily when life feels ordered and understandable. Egypt's routines created a sense of structure that softened the emotional weight of difficult labor. A worker knew when floods would likely come. Knew when planting would begin. Knew when taxes would be collected. Knew when festivals would arrive. These expectations gave shape to time itself. Meanwhile, along the Nile, river traffic increased beneath the brightening sun. Sails caught morning wind. Long wooden boats drifted north carrying grain, stone, papyrus, pottery, linen, and passengers between settlements. Some vessels transported government supplies. Others belonged to merchants moving goods through trade networks stretching far beyond local villages. Travel along the Nile connected Egypt together like a living thread. Without the river, communities would have remained isolated beside harsh desert terrain. But the Nile allowed ideas, goods, customs, and authority to move steadily across great distances. A traveler drifting along the river might pass endless scenes of ordinary life. Women washing clothing near muddy banks. Children splashing in shallow water. Laborers unloading cargo beneath the heat. Temple columns rising above palm groves. Cattle drinking quietly beside reeds. Farmers guiding oxen through dark soil. The landscape repeated itself gently mile after mile. And this repetition reinforced the sense that Egypt itself was one continuous world connected through shared rhythms. By midday, the sun stood high over the valley once again. Heat spread across fields and villages with heavy intensity. Stone surfaces became hot to the touch. Air shimmered above roads. Workers wiped sweat from their faces using rough linen cloth while searching for brief moments of shade. Some rested beneath date palms beside irrigation canals. Others sat against mud brick walls sharing beer from clay jars before returning to work. The Egyptian relationship with heat shaped the entire pace of life. People understood when to work hard and when to slow down. Afternoon exhaustion became expected rather than surprising. Labor crews often paused during the harshest hours before continuing later as temperatures softened slightly. This adaptation to climate helped society function smoothly within difficult environmental conditions. Ancient Egypt did not fight against nature constantly. Instead, people organized themselves around the rhythms of river, sun, flood, and season. Adaptation creates stability. And Egypt adapted extraordinarily well to its environment. Farther north, near a busy workshop district in a larger city, craftsmen continued shaping objects needed throughout the kingdom. Potters spun wheels steadily while wet clay cooled their hands. Weavers worked beside looms producing linen cloth from flax harvested along the river. Carpenters carved furniture from imported wood while apprentices swept dust from crowded floors. These workshops rarely felt quiet. Hammers struck metal. Tools scraped wood. Voices drifted through open doorways. Animals passed outside in the streets. Yet even here, beneath the noise and movement, routines remained deeply established. Skills passed carefully from older workers to younger ones. Methods changed slowly. Craft traditions survived across generations because stability allowed long-term learning to flourish. A master potter might teach the same techniques his grandfather had once taught him decades earlier. The continuity of knowledge mattered enormously. Societies remain stable when practical skills survive across time without interruption. Egypt preserved agricultural knowledge, construction knowledge, religious knowledge, administrative knowledge, craft knowledge. Again and again, information moved steadily from one generation into the next. And so the civilization endured. As afternoon faded slowly toward evening, shadows stretched long across the Nile Valley. The worst heat lifted at last. Birds circled low above the river while fishermen prepared evening nets near the shore. Laborers returned from fields and workshops coated in dust and sweat. Some carried tools. Others carried food or water for the household. The roads filled gently with tired movement. Yet evenings often brought relief too. Children laughed more freely after the day's labor ended. Families gathered outside homes where cooler air finally moved through the streets. Cooking fires glowed softly beneath darkening skies. The smell of evening meals drifted everywhere. Bread baking. Fish roasting. Onions cooking slowly over open flame. Simple food. Simple routines. But these ordinary habits formed the foundation of Egyptian continuity. A civilization survives through millions of repeated evenings exactly like these. People resting together. Sharing meals. Repairing tools. Listening to stories. Preparing quietly for tomorrow. As darkness settled fully over the land once more, temple ceremonies continued beneath flickering oil lamps. Priests moved through shadowed halls with careful steps. Incense smoke curled upward toward painted ceilings while sacred chants echoed softly between stone columns, cool to the touch even after the heat of the day. Elsewhere, on quiet rooftops beneath the stars, families drifted gradually toward sleep. The river nearby reflected moonlight again. Boats rocked gently against wooden docks. Palm leaves whispered softly in the warm night wind. And through another peaceful night beside the Nile, ancient Egypt continued resting within the same calm rhythms that had carried the civilization forward for century after century beneath the endless desert sky. The Nile moved quietly through the darkness as another night slowly passed over Egypt. Moonlight rested across the surface of the water in long trembling patterns. Reeds near the banks bent gently beneath warm wind drifting in from the desert. Somewhere far away, a bird called once through the night air before silence returned again. Most of the villages along the river were still asleep. Inside small homes made from mud brick, workers rested beside family members after another exhausting day beneath the sun. Clay jars stood cooling near the walls. Woven baskets sat beside sleeping mats. Fine dust covered almost every surface, carried endlessly through open doors and narrow streets by the dry Egyptian wind. The air smelled faintly of ashes and river water. For a few quiet hours, the labor of the civilization paused. But only briefly. Long before sunrise, movement slowly returned to the Nile Valley once again. A baker rose from sleep while the stars still hung above the rooftops. His joints felt stiff as he stood. Years of kneading dough and lifting heavy grain sacks had slowly worn down his body. Still, the work awaited him, just as it had yesterday and the day before that. And so he began again. He stepped outside into cool darkness carrying a small oil lamp. Nearby houses remained quiet. A dog wandered slowly through the empty street searching for scraps left from the evening meal. Palm trees shifted gently overhead while the river moved almost silently beyond the village. In ancient Egypt, many people lived by routines so familiar that they could almost perform them half asleep. Hands remembered tasks automatically. Grinding grain, lighting ovens, mending nets, preparing tools. The body itself carried memory from years of repetition. This repetition became part of the civilization's stability. People did not wake each day wondering how life should function. Expectations were deeply established. Roles within households and communities remained relatively clear. The farming seasons guided the larger structure of time, while daily labor filled the smaller spaces between sunrise and sleep. Soon other homes began waking too. Small points of orange firelight appeared behind reed doorways. Smoke rose slowly into the fading darkness. Water jars clinked softly. Footsteps sounded against packed earth roads. Egypt was awakening once more. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared for the morning in near silence. They untangled damp nets beside narrow wooden boats while cool mist drifted above the water. Some checked woven traps left overnight among the reeds. Others studied the river carefully, watching the movement of currents and birds. Fishing required observation, patience, and understanding of the Nile's moods. For generations, Egyptian fishermen learned these patterns from older relatives. Fathers taught sons where fish gathered during different seasons. Grandfathers explained how floodwaters changed the riverbanks. Knowledge passed slowly through conversation and shared labor rather than through written instruction alone. This passing down of practical wisdom helped stabilize daily life. Children entered adulthood already understanding the world around them. A young farmer knew when to prepare fields. A potter's apprentice knew how clay should feel beneath the hands. A boatman understood the wind patterns of the river. Knowledge lived inside people as much as inside records. As dawn approached, the eastern horizon slowly brightened beyond the palm trees. Birds began calling across the wetlands. Frogs slipped quietly into shallow water beside irrigation canals. The first golden light touched temple walls and village rooftops one after another. Another day had arrived beside the Nile. And like the countless days before it, this one began with work. Workers moved steadily into the fields carrying wooden hoes, baskets, ropes, and water containers. Some guided oxen through soft earth darkened by recent irrigation. Others repaired narrow canals clogged by mud and reeds. The agricultural system of Egypt demanded constant attention. Water had to be directed carefully. Fields needed maintenance. Flood levels required monitoring. Storage facilities had to remain dry and secure. Because so many people depended on the harvest, farming became more than individual labor. It became a shared responsibility woven across villages, officials, temples, and households alike. This shared dependence strengthened social cooperation. People understood that survival relied on systems larger than any one family alone. A damaged irrigation wall affected entire communities. A failed flood threatened whole regions. And so labor was often organized collectively. Groups repaired canals together. Neighbors shared harvest work. Officials coordinated large projects tied directly to agriculture and storage. This cooperation created resilience. Even when difficulties arrived, the broader structure often remained strong enough to recover. As sunlight spread higher across the valley, Egypt slowly filled with sound. Oxen breathing heavily in the fields. Wooden wheels creaking beneath loaded carts. Children calling to one another through village streets. Hammering from workshops. Temple music drifting faintly through warm air. Yet despite the movement and labor, much of Egyptian life remained calm in its rhythm. People rarely hurried. The environment itself discouraged frantic energy. Heat punished unnecessary effort. Long distances encouraged patience. Boats traveled with wind and current rather than speed. Even major construction unfolded gradually across decades. Time moved differently beside the Nile. A worker might spend 20 years helping shape stone blocks for one temple wall. A scribe might record harvests using the same methods his ancestors had used centuries earlier. A farming family could remain connected to the same fields generation after generation. This long continuity created deep cultural stability. People felt anchored to place and tradition. And because traditions changed slowly, society itself often felt predictable. Inside a crowded workshop in one of Egypt's larger towns, several young apprentices sat cross-legged on the floor shaping clay vessels beneath the watchful eyes of older craftsmen. The room was already hot. Sunlight entered through narrow openings high in the wall, illuminating dust drifting lazily through the air. Rows of finished pottery lined wooden shelves while wet clay cooled beneath damp cloths nearby. The apprentices worked carefully. A mistake could ruin hours of labor. But the older craftsmen corrected them patiently because skilled work mattered greatly within Egyptian society. Pottery, tools, woven cloth, baskets, boats, and furniture all supported the daily functioning of millions of lives. Stability depends upon ordinary objects. Storage jars protect grain supplies. Fishing nets provide food. Boats connect communities. Sandals protect feet walking endless roads. Behind every stable civilization stands an enormous world of quiet craftsmanship. Egypt understood this through practice more than theory. Every worker contributed to the larger order in some small way. Even scribes, whose lives often seemed more comfortable than those of manual laborers, played essential roles within the civilization's continuity. Inside administrative buildings near temple complexes, scribes spent long hours recording grain deliveries, labor assignments, land measurements, tax collections, and legal agreements. The work required concentration. Reed pens scratched softly against papyrus while flies drifted through the warm rooms. Apprentices copied symbols repeatedly onto broken pottery fragments as instructors watched nearby. Most Egyptians could not read. But writing itself became one of the invisible tools holding the civilization together. Records preserved continuity beyond human memory. When floods altered farmland boundaries, written measurements helped restore order. When grain moved between storage centers, records tracked supplies carefully. When rulers changed, administration continued because knowledge survived through documentation. The system was not perfect. Corruption existed. Mistakes happened. Officials sometimes abused power. Yet overall, the bureaucratic structure remained surprisingly durable across long stretches of history. And durability creates stability. By midday, the sun stood fiercely above the Nile Valley once again. Heat pressed heavily against the land. Workers wrapped linen around their heads while sweat darkened their clothing. Animals crowded beneath shaded areas wherever they could find relief. Roads shimmered in the bright light. Many laborers paused briefly during the hottest hours. Some rested beside canals with tired feet in cool water. Others shared bread and beer beneath palm trees while speaking quietly about crop conditions, river levels, or village matters. Beer remained an important part of daily nutrition. Thick and nourishing, it helped sustain workers through long labor beneath the sun. Bread and beer together formed the foundation of ordinary Egyptian diets for centuries. Simple foods, but dependable foods. Dependability mattered deeply. When people trust that basic needs will likely be met tomorrow, societies become calmer and more stable. Egypt's agricultural success allowed large populations to survive with relatively consistent access to staple foods across many generations. Of course, no ancient civilization escaped hardship completely. Illness remained common. Children sometimes died young. Accidents injured workers constantly. Floods occasionally failed. But compared to many regions of the ancient world, Egypt experienced unusually long periods where daily life continued without total disruption. This continuity shaped the psychology of the civilization. People expected the world to endure. They expected temples to stand. Expected the Nile to return. Expected tomorrow to resemble yesterday in important ways. And often, it did. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, long shadows stretched across the fields again. The worst heat faded little by little. Workers gathered tools and began the slow journey homeward through dusty roads glowing orange beneath the lowering sun. The evening hours brought relief. Children played more freely now that labor had ended. Women prepared meals while smoke drifted upward through cooling air. Older men sat outside homes repairing tools or telling stories beneath the fading light. The Nile reflected the colors of sunset beautifully. Gold. Orange. Deep red. Then slowly blue once more. Boats drifted quietly toward shore while birds circled low above the water preparing for night. And once darkness settled fully over Egypt again, the land returned to silence little by little. Oil lamps flickered behind small windows. Families rested beside one another after another long day. The stars appeared above the desert. The river continued moving patiently through the night. And across the Nile Valley, Ancient Egypt remained held together by the same endless routines, shared labor, and quiet endurance that had carried the civilization safely through century after century beneath the calm and watchful sky. The wind moved softly through the reeds beside the Nile as another quiet night settled over ancient Egypt. The river reflected the stars in long trembling lines that shifted gently with the current. Along the banks, small boats rested against wooden docks tied carefully with thick rope darkened by years of water and sun. Palm trees leaned slightly in the warm night breeze while distant temple walls stood pale beneath the moonlight. Most of the people of Egypt were asleep. Inside crowded homes, families rested after another long day of labor. Linen blankets covered tired bodies stretched across woven mats. Clay water jars cooled slowly in the darkness. Nearby, tools used during the day leaned quietly against mud-brick walls. For many workers, sleep came quickly. The physical demands of Egyptian life drained the body completely. Farmers spent hours bent over fields beneath burning sunlight. Builders carried stone and timber through choking dust. Fishermen hauled heavy wet nets from the river. Women ground grain daily until shoulders and wrists ached deeply. The civilization endured because millions of ordinary people accepted these rhythms as part of life itself. And so, beneath the calm night sky, Egypt rested. But even in darkness, the Nile Valley never became entirely still. A small riverboat drifted northward beneath the moon carrying grain sealed inside clay containers. The men aboard spoke quietly while guiding the vessel through the slow-moving water. One adjusted the sail carefully as wind shifted across the river. Another watched the shoreline where occasional lamps glowed faintly near sleeping villages. Travel at night could feel peaceful beside the Nile. The heat softened. The noise faded. Only water and wind remained. The boatmen likely knew every bend in the river from memory. They had traveled these waters many times before, carrying goods between communities connected through the endless flow of trade and labor that held Egypt together. Without this movement along the Nile, the kingdom would have struggled to remain unified for so long. The river acted almost like a road made of water. Messages traveled along it. Food traveled along it. Stone, timber, pottery, papyrus, livestock, and people all moved through Egypt upon the river's surface. And because movement remained relatively reliable, the state could organize itself with unusual consistency for the ancient world. As the night slowly passed, the eastern horizon eventually began to pale once again. Morning returned gradually. The stars faded. Birds stirred within the reeds. A cool gray light spread softly across the fields and villages lining the Nile. Another day was arriving. In a small settlement near a bend in the river, an elderly woman stepped outside her home before sunrise carrying an empty clay jar. The earth beneath her sandals felt cool for now, though she knew the heat would return soon enough. She walked slowly toward the water alongside others already awake for the day's work. Some carried fishing equipment. Others carried baskets or tools. A young child walked sleepily beside his mother holding tightly to the edge of her linen clothing. Morning routines repeated themselves endlessly across Egypt. Fetch water. Prepare bread. Feed animals. Repair tools. Light cooking fires. These tasks rarely changed, and perhaps that constancy brought a quiet sense of security. Even when rulers changed or dynasties rose and fell far away, ordinary life beside the Nile often continued in familiar ways. The people of Egypt understood repetition deeply. They trusted cycles. The flood would come again. Seeds would be planted again. Children would grow. Old people would pass quietly into memory. The stars would return each night above the desert. This cyclical understanding shaped how Egyptians viewed the world itself. Time did not feel entirely linear beside the Nile. Instead, life moved in repeating circles tied to nature, labor, and ritual. This outlook encouraged patience. And patience strengthened stability. As sunlight slowly touched the tops of the palm trees, workers moved toward the fields once more. Thin mist still hovered over irrigation canals cut carefully through dark soil. Frogs disappeared into shallow water as footsteps approached. Oxen snorted heavily while farmers guided them into position beside wooden plows. Agriculture in Egypt required organization more than speed. Water had to be directed properly through canals and basins. Fields needed coordination across communities sharing irrigation systems. Officials monitored crop conditions because harvests affected taxation, storage supplies, temple offerings, and food distribution throughout the kingdom. A successful harvest brought relief to nearly everyone. When grain stores remained full, anxiety eased. Families ate more steadily. Workers could be supplied. Trade remained active. Temples continued functioning smoothly. Food stability created social stability. And Egypt's geography made food production unusually reliable compared to many ancient regions. The Nile floods renewed the soil naturally year after year. Rich black earth remained fertile without constant expansion into new lands. Farmers along the river could often predict agricultural seasons with reasonable confidence. This predictability shaped daily psychology in powerful ways. People could plan ahead. Storage systems could function effectively. Governments could organize labor more calmly. Even religious ceremonies followed the agricultural cycle closely. Everything connected back to the river. By mid-morning, the villages were alive with movement. Children carried bundles of reeds through dusty roads. Women sat weaving linen outside shaded doorways. Donkeys moved slowly beneath heavy loads while merchants arranged fish, vegetables, pottery, and cloth within crowded market spaces. The sounds of ordinary Egyptian life blended together softly. Grinding stones scraping grain. Voices bargaining over goods. Animals shifting against wooden fences. Water splashing into jars. Hammers tapping against bronze or wood. None of it felt hurried. Life moved steadily rather than quickly. The climate itself encouraged this pace. Fast movement beneath intense heat wasted precious energy. People learned to work with patience and rhythm instead. Even construction projects reflected this slower understanding of time. Near a temple complex farther north, labor crews hauled limestone blocks beneath the growing sun. Teams worked together using ropes, sledges, wooden rollers, and careful coordination. Sweat covered their skin almost immediately. Dust clung to their arms and faces. The labor was difficult beyond words. Yet many workers likely viewed participation in temple or tomb construction as normal rather than extraordinary. Large building projects had existed throughout Egyptian memory for generations. The sight of rising stone walls, carved statues, and expanding temple courtyards would have felt familiar across much of the Nile Valley. And importantly, these projects provided work. When floodwaters covered farmland during certain seasons, agricultural workers could be redirected toward state labor projects instead of remaining idle. This helped maintain social organization during periods when normal farming slowed temporarily. The system was demanding, but practical. A stable society must keep large populations occupied productively. Egypt developed ways to organize labor according to seasonal rhythms shaped directly by the Nile. Inside the temple nearby, priests moved through cool stone halls preparing morning rituals. The contrast between temple interiors and the heat outside must have felt striking. Thick stone walls trapped cool air. Incense drifted through dim chambers lit by flickering oil lamps. Carved columns rose overhead covered with images of gods, birds, reeds, stars, and flowing water. The ceremonies unfolded carefully. Measured words. Repeated gestures. Offerings placed in precise order. Ritual consistency reinforced emotional stability across the civilization. The gods were honored each day through familiar actions repeated across generations. People believed cosmic order depended partly upon maintaining these sacred routines. Religion and stability were deeply connected in Egypt. The sun rising each morning represented order triumphing over chaos. The Nile flooding properly represented divine balance. Even kings ruled partly as guardians of harmony within the world. Ordinary people carried these ideas quietly into daily life. A farmer repairing irrigation channels was participating in the maintenance of order. A scribe recording grain supplies supported balance and continuity. A mother preparing food for her household preserved stability within the family itself. Small actions mattered. And because millions of small actions repeated reliably over time, the civilization remained remarkably durable. By midday, heat spread heavily across the Nile Valley once more. The air shimmered above roads and rooftops. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads while searching for patches of shade. Dogs rested beneath carts. Birds became quieter beneath the blazing sun overhead. Fatigue settled over the land. This midday exhaustion was part of Egyptian life for everyone except perhaps the wealthiest elites sheltered inside larger homes and palace compounds. For ordinary people, the body constantly negotiated with heat, labor, hunger, and exhaustion. Yet people adapted. They rested when possible. Worked steadily rather than frantically. Consumed food and drink suited to the climate. Built homes with thick walls and small openings that reduced sunlight and trapped cooler air. Adaptation helped Egypt survive. Rather than resisting the environment completely, Egyptians shaped their civilization around the realities of river and desert. And because those environmental realities remained relatively stable for long periods, society itself gained stability too. As afternoon slowly faded, workers eventually began returning toward their homes. The sunlight softened from white to gold. Long shadows stretched across fields and canals. The Nile reflected the evening sky in calm shimmering colors. Children played beside the roads while older relatives sat outside homes enjoying the cooler air at last. The evening meal slowly brought families together again. Bread torn by hand. Fish cooked over open fires. Beer poured into simple cups. Conversation remained gentle after the exhaustion of the day. No one needed great entertainment. Rest itself became precious enough. Night arrived gradually once more over Egypt. The stars returned above the desert. Temple chants faded into silence. Boats rocked softly against the riverbank beneath moonlight. And throughout the Nile Valley, ancient families drifted back into sleep beside the calm river that had carried their civilization safely through generation after generation beneath the endless sky. The Nile flowed gently beneath the stars while another warm night stretched across ancient Egypt. Far from the riverbanks, the desert remained dark and silent, a vast sea of stone and sand untouched by lamps or voices. But along the narrow fertile ribbon beside the water, life continued quietly even through the deepest hours of the night. A small fire flickered outside a riverside home where two fishermen sat repairing nets before sleep. Their fingers moved slowly through the worn rope fibers while insects drifted through the warm air around them. Nearby, the dark river brushed softly against wooden boats tied to the shore. One of the men paused for a moment and looked upward at the stars overhead. The night sky above ancient Egypt must have felt enormous. Without smoke from machines or bright city lights, the heavens appeared sharp and endless. Generations of Egyptians slept beneath the same constellations. Farmers, priests, builders, servants, children, kings, and laborers all looked upward into the same calm darkness. The stars themselves became part of the civilization's stability. They returned each night in familiar patterns. Predictable. Ordered. Steady. Much of Egyptian life rested emotionally upon the belief that the world moved according to rhythms that could be trusted. And for long stretches of time, that belief proved true. The river returned. The floods returned. The sunrise returned. Even after hardship, the larger patterns endured. Eventually the fishermen finished their work and the small fire faded into glowing red embers. The village grew quieter. Families slept behind mud-brick walls cooled slightly by the night breeze drifting in from the Nile. Some people murmured softly in dreams. Others shifted upon woven mats before settling again into stillness. Only a few remained awake now. A temple guard carrying an oil lamp through a silent courtyard. A mother comforting a restless child. Boatmen guiding cargo through moonlit water farther north. Ancient Egypt never fully stopped moving. Even during the quietest hours, someone somewhere was still working. Before dawn, the air became cooler for a short while. This was often the gentlest moment of the entire day. The heat loosened its grip briefly. Reeds along the riverbanks glistened faintly with moisture. Birds stirred quietly within the palm trees as the eastern horizon slowly began to change color once more. Another morning approached. And with it came another return to routine. In a crowded household near a farming settlement, a young woman rose carefully without waking the children sleeping nearby. She stepped across the packed earth floor toward the small cooking area near the wall. The room smelled faintly of smoke, grain dust, and warm clay. Reaching for a basket of stored grain, she began the familiar work of grinding flour before sunrise. The sound filled the quiet room softly. Stone against stone. Slow. Steady. Repetitive. Countless Egyptian mornings began exactly this way. For centuries, women across the Nile Valley spent long hours preparing food through physically demanding labor rarely remembered in royal histories. Yet these daily acts sustained the entire civilization. Without bread, workers could not labor. Without households functioning steadily, fields would empty and workshops would fall silent. Stability begins in ordinary rooms long before it reaches palaces or temples. Outside, the village slowly awakened around her. Doors opened. Footsteps sounded through narrow roads. A donkey brayed somewhere nearby. Thin lines of smoke rose into the pale morning sky. Soon the fields would fill again with laborers carrying tools across their shoulders toward the dark fertile soil beside the river. And so the cycle continued. The Egyptian relationship with labor was deeply connected to nature's rhythms. People understood that survival depended on regular effort rather than sudden bursts of energy. Crops demanded patience. Irrigation systems required maintenance. Boats needed repair. Nets needed mending. There was always more work waiting. Yet because this work followed familiar seasonal patterns, society rarely felt completely directionless. People knew what each season required. Flood season. Planting season. Harvest season. Storage season. The calendar itself became part of social stability. By sunrise, the Nile Valley was already alive with movement. Farmers guided animals toward the fields. Children carried water jars from wells and canals. Merchants arranged vegetables, fish, pottery, and woven cloth beneath shaded market coverings. Scribes traveled slowly toward administrative buildings carrying writing pallets tucked beneath their arms. The sounds of Egypt blended together into a familiar rhythm. Wood creaking beneath loaded carts. Voices greeting neighbors. The splash of water lifted into jars. Birds circling above the wetlands. Tools striking stone or wood in distant workshops. Nothing felt sudden. Nothing moved too fast. Even in busy cities, ancient life unfolded with a slower pace shaped by daylight, climate, and physical effort. Near one large temple complex, groups of laborers worked repairing sections of an outer wall damaged gradually by time and weather. The men carried baskets of mud plaster while supervisors inspected cracks in the stonework. Dust floated through warm air illuminated by early sunlight. Nearby priests passed quietly through temple courtyards already preparing the morning rituals. Temples stood at the center of Egyptian stability in many ways. They were religious spaces, economic centers, storage sites, employers, places of learning, symbols of permanence. Large temple institutions owned land, organized labor, stored grain, and distributed resources. During difficult years, temples sometimes helped feed struggling populations from reserve supplies. People trusted these institutions because they endured across generations. A child might grow into old age seeing the same temple walls standing unchanged beside the river. This visible continuity shaped emotional life deeply. Humans feel calmer when important structures appear permanent. And Egypt surrounded itself with permanence whenever possible. Stone temples, stone tombs, stone statues, written records carved into walls meant to outlast memory itself. Meanwhile, ordinary homes remained fragile by comparison. Mud brick walls required regular repair. Roofs sagged over time. Floodwaters occasionally damaged buildings near the riverbanks. Yet even this contrast reinforced the Egyptian understanding of existence. Human life was temporary. But the larger order endured. The civilization itself felt eternal. As morning stretched toward noon, heat slowly intensified across the valley. Sweat darkened linen clothing almost immediately for workers in the open sun. Dust clung to skin. Oxen moved more slowly through the fields while laborers paused occasionally to wipe their faces or drink water carried in clay containers. The body's relationship with heat shaped nearly every aspect of daily routine. Work began early. Midday brought slower movement. Evening became a time for recovery. People adapted carefully because survival required respecting the climate rather than fighting against it. This practical adaptation helped Egypt remain stable where other regions faced harsher environmental uncertainty. The Nile offered reliable water. The seasons remained relatively predictable. The surrounding deserts protected the fertile core from many outside threats. Geography itself supported continuity. Along the river, boats drifted steadily between settlements carrying goods essential to everyday life. Papyrus bundles, fish packed in salt, clay pottery, grain sacks, copper tools, linen cloth. The movement of goods through Egypt created a web of dependence linking villages, cities, temples, and workshops together. A farmer relied upon craftsmen for tools. Craftsmen relied upon farmers for food. Officials relied upon scribes for records. Everyone relied upon the river. This interconnectedness strengthened the civilization because no single community existed entirely alone. Shared systems encourage shared stability. By afternoon, exhaustion settled heavily across the land once again. Workers rested in whatever shade they could find. Some sat beside canals with feet in cool water while speaking quietly with neighbors. Others leaned against walls eating bread softened with beer after hours beneath the blazing sun. Physical fatigue became a normal part of existence. Ancient Egyptian bodies endured tremendous strain over lifetimes of manual labor. Many workers probably suffered constant aches by middle age. Teeth wore down from coarse bread containing tiny particles of grit from grinding stones. Eyes strained beneath harsh sunlight and blowing dust. Yet despite hardship, people continued building families, communities, and traditions that lasted across centuries. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. Especially when life feels meaningful and connected to familiar routines. As the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, shadows stretched long across the fields again. Birds returned toward the riverbanks. The air softened little by little. Workers gathered tools and began making their way home through dusty roads glowing beneath golden light. The return home after labor carried its own quiet comfort. Children waiting near doorways. The smell of cooking fires. Cooler air moving through narrow streets. The simple relief of sitting down after standing all day beneath the sun. These moments mattered deeply. Civilizations endure not only through laws and armies, but through ordinary human satisfaction found in rest, food, family, and familiarity. Night eventually returned once more over Egypt. Temple lamps flickered softly behind tall stone walls. Boats rocked gently against the shore. The stars emerged again above the silent desert. And beside the calm flowing Nile, ancient families drifted slowly into sleep while the civilization around them continued breathing in the same patient rhythm that had carried Egypt safely forward for generations beyond counting. The evening wind drifted softly across the Nile while darkness slowly gathered over the valley once again. Along the riverbanks, reeds whispered together beneath the warm night air. The water moved patiently through the land, reflecting pale moonlight between clusters of palm trees and sleeping villages. Far beyond the fertile green edges of the Nile, the desert stretched outward into silence, vast and unmoving beneath the stars. Ancient Egypt rested quietly. Inside mud-brick homes, families settled close together after another long day beneath the heavy sun. Cooking fires had faded into glowing embers. Clay bowls sat empty beside woven sleeping mats. Sandals coated with dust from the roads rested near low doorways. The exhaustion of labor lingered inside every home. Workers carried the day within their bodies long after sunset. Sore backs. Tired feet. Hands roughened by rope, tools, and stone. Yet despite the strain, evening often brought a feeling of calm relief. The worst heat had passed. Tomorrow's labor still belonged to tomorrow. For a few hours, people could simply rest beside one another beneath the quiet sky. Near one small village farther south along the river, an old man sat outside his home watching the stars slowly brighten overhead. He had spent most of his life farming land beside the Nile. Season after season, he had watched floodwaters rise over the fields and then retreat again, leaving behind dark fertile soil ready for planting. The river had shaped nearly every memory of his life. As a child, he learned to swim in its shallow edges. As a young worker, he carried water from its canals. As a father, he watched his own children run barefoot beside its muddy banks. The Nile connected generations together quietly. People were born beside it, worked beside it, and eventually were buried beneath the same skies that watched the river continue flowing onward without end. This continuity gave ancient Egyptian life a deep sense of permanence. Individual lives felt temporary, certainly. Illness, accidents, and exhaustion remained close companions in the ancient world. But the civilization itself seemed eternal. The river returned each year. The temples endured. The stars appeared again each night. And because these larger patterns remained steady across generations, people developed profound trust in the stability of their world. Even periods of hardship often felt temporary compared to the endless continuity of the Nile itself. As the night deepened, the villages became quieter still. A baby cried briefly from inside one crowded home before falling silent again. Somewhere near the fields, a dog barked toward the darkness. In the distance, the faint sound of temple music drifted softly across the cooling air before fading into silence. The priests inside the temples were still awake. Temple life followed strict routines that continued long after ordinary households slept. Sacred spaces had to be maintained carefully. Lamps required oil. Offerings needed preparation. Rituals followed precise schedules repeated day after day across centuries. Inside the cool stone halls of a temple complex near the river, priests moved quietly through shadowed corridors carrying small oil lamps. The air smelled of incense, smoke, and warm stone. Massive columns disappeared upward into darkness above them, carved with images of gods, birds, flowing water, stars, and sacred reeds. Footsteps echoed softly against polished floors while flames flickered gently inside bronze lamps. The rituals unfolding inside these temples were not meant to change quickly. Consistency itself held sacred meaning. The Egyptians believed balance and order protected the world from chaos. Maintaining rituals correctly became part of preserving that order. And so the ceremonies continued. Morning after morning. Night after night. Generation after generation. The people of Egypt found comfort in repetition because repetition suggested stability. Outside the temple walls, the river continued moving quietly through the darkness. A small cargo boat drifted northward beneath the moon carrying grain sealed inside heavy jars. The boatmen aboard spoke little. One guided the vessel carefully through the current while another rested beside bundled cargo covered with linen cloth. Transport along the Nile remained one of the great strengths of Egyptian civilization. The river connected distant regions naturally. Goods moved more easily by water than across harsh desert roads. Communication traveled steadily between settlements. Officials could coordinate resources over long distances because boats linked the kingdom together like threads woven through fabric. This geographic unity helped Egypt survive where many ancient societies fractured into isolated regions. People along the Nile shared common rhythms, common seasons, common dependence upon the river. Even villages separated by long distances still understood the same agricultural cycle shaping daily life across the land. Before dawn, cool air briefly returned to the valley. This short period before sunrise carried a special quietness. The heat loosened. The wind softened. Mist hovered low above canals and riverbanks. For a little while, the world felt gentle again. Soon enough the labor would begin once more. But for now, Egypt remained suspended between night and morning. In one crowded household, a young mother woke before anyone else and sat quietly beside the doorway listening to the distant sound of water moving through irrigation channels. Her children still slept nearby. One small hand rested across a woven blanket while another child murmured softly in dreams. The room smelled faintly of dust, grain, and smoke trapped within the mud-brick walls. She knew the tasks waiting for her after sunrise. Grinding grain. Preparing bread. Carrying water. Cleaning tools. Watching children. Repairing clothing. Like many women in ancient Egypt, her labor formed part of the invisible structure supporting everyday stability. History often remembers kings and monuments. But civilizations survive because ordinary households continue functioning steadily across time. The preparation of food. The care of children. The repair of homes. These quiet acts carried Egypt forward just as surely as stone temples or royal decrees. Outside, the horizon slowly began to brighten. Birds stirred within the reeds. The stars faded one by one above the desert. Another day was arriving beside the Nile. And as always, Egypt awakened gradually. A baker opened his oven while darkness still lingered in the streets. Fishermen untied boats from wooden posts along the shore. Farmers gathered tools worn smooth from years of use. The smell of smoke and fresh bread slowly spread through the villages once more. Daily life resumed almost exactly as it had the day before. And the day before that. And countless days before those. This repetition created psychological calm across generations. People understood what life required. The farming seasons organized time naturally. Religious festivals marked important transitions during the year. The floodwaters themselves acted almost like a giant clock guiding the civilization's rhythm. Even the government relied heavily upon these predictable agricultural patterns. Taxes were tied to harvests. Labor schedules shifted with flood seasons. Storage systems depended on regular grain production. The state itself functioned partly because nature remained relatively dependable. As sunlight spread across the valley, workers moved steadily toward the fields once again. The dark fertile soil near the Nile contrasted sharply against the pale desert beyond it. Irrigation channels reflected the growing morning light while oxen pulled wooden plows slowly through damp earth. The labor was repetitive. But repetition also builds expertise. Egyptian farmers understood their environment deeply because generations had worked the same land continuously for centuries. Knowledge about flood timing, soil conditions, irrigation, and crop cycles passed carefully from older workers to younger ones. This preserved agricultural stability across long stretches of time. Children learned by watching, by helping, by repeating tasks until they became natural. A young boy carrying water beside his father today might someday teach the same work to his own children beneath the same sun beside the same river. And so continuity deepened through ordinary family life. By midday, heat once again covered the Nile Valley heavily. Workers rested briefly beneath palm trees or beside canals whenever possible. Sweat darkened linen clothing while dust settled across skin and tools alike. The pace of labor slowed beneath the worst heat. People adapted carefully to the environment because survival depended upon respecting the climate rather than resisting it blindly. Ancient Egypt succeeded partly because it learned to live in balance with its surroundings. The river provided life. The desert provided protection. The seasons provided structure. And the people organized themselves patiently around these realities. As evening finally approached once more, golden sunlight stretched across the water and fields. Boats drifted homeward. Children gathered near cooking fires. Workers returned slowly through dusty roads carrying tools over tired shoulders. The familiar comfort of evening settled gently over the land again. And beneath the first returning stars above the Nile, ancient Egypt continued onward through another calm and ordinary night held together by routine, endurance, and the quiet trust that tomorrow would arrive much like today beside the patient river. The night settled softly over the Nile one final time. The river moved quietly through the darkness, calm and unhurried beneath the endless stars of ancient Egypt. Reeds along the banks bent gently in the warm desert wind. Far across the water, small lamps glowed faintly beside distant homes before fading one by one into silence. The labor of the day was finished now. Farmers rested beside their families after long hours in the fields. Fishermen slept near their folded nets. Bakers, scribes, builders, servants, and merchants all drifted slowly into sleep beneath mud-brick roofs still warm from the sun. The temples stood silent in the moonlight. Tall stone columns watched over the quiet land just as they had for generations beyond memory. The smell of incense had faded from the halls. Oil lamps burned low inside the sacred chambers while shadows stretched softly across carved walls. And still the Nile continued flowing. Steady. Patient. Endless. For centuries, the people of Egypt had trusted this river. They built their lives around its rhythms. They woke beside it each morning. Worked beneath the heat of the sun. Rested beneath the stars. Then rose again to do the same gentle routines once more. Bread baking before sunrise. Sandals against dusty roads. Water carried carefully from the river. Children laughing beside the reeds. The sound of grain grinding in quiet homes. The soft splash of oars moving through morning mist. These ordinary moments carried the civilization forward more than kings or monuments ever could. And now, as the night deepens over the ancient world, the sounds grow quieter. The boats drift gently against their ropes. The fields rest beneath silver moonlight. Palm leaves whisper softly in the warm wind. Far away, somewhere beyond the sleeping villages, a final bird call fades into the darkness beside the Nile. The stars remain overhead. Ancient. Still. Watching silently as Egypt sleeps. And slowly, beside the calm river and the endless desert sky, the old world drifts peacefully into silence.